Tonight, we enter the Old World, not as tourists walking through ruins with maps in our hands, but as witnesses standing beneath a black and glittering sky, beside the low fires of shepherds, thieves, soldiers, mothers, kings, and exiles, in a land where the gods and mortals were still believed to walk the earth, long before Rome became marble, law, empire, conquest, and collapse. It was a place of mud and smoke, a bend in the Tiber, a cluster of huts on hills, a dangerous crossing, a patchwork of villages set among marshland, woodland, and volcanic stone. There were no emperors yet, no legions marching in scarlet ranks across Europe, no senators wrapped in white wool, speaking of destiny beneath painted ceilings, no triumphal arches, no Colosseum, no Mediterranean world trembling at the sound of a Latin command. There was only a frontier. Here, in central Italy, the land was restless. The river could feed you or drown you. The hills could protect you or imprison you. The nearby salt road carried wealth, but also raiders. The sea was not far away, and across that sea, older civilizations had already risen into brilliance. The Greeks had sent ships westward. The Phoenicians had stitched trading routes across the waters. The Etruscans to the north had built cities of wealth, ritual, metallurgy, and tombs painted with music, feasting, and strange joy. To the south, Greek colonies looked back toward the Aegean, bringing letters, gods, pottery, and the hard beauty of stone temples. Rome began in the shadow of greater worlds, and yet something happened here, something almost impossible. From this river crossing, from these hut circles and cremation burials, from these early layers recovered through stratigraphic excavation beneath later temples, streets, and imperial monuments, emerged a society that learned not only how to survive, but how to absorb. Rome did not merely defeat its enemies, it studied them, it copied them, it married them, it enslaved them, it gave them citizenship, stole their gods, borrowed their armor, built roads through their lands, founded colonies among them, and told them, with terrifying patience, that resistance was temporary, but Rome was permanent. Radiocarbon dating, pottery typology, inscriptional evidence, lithic analysis, paleobotanical remains, ancient DNA, and the slow work of archaeology all show us fragments of this beginning. They do not give us the whole story. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. The earliest Rome is not a clean tale preserved in perfect record. It is a broken mirror, a handful of post holes, charred grain, infant burials, defensive ditches, imported ceramics, later myths written centuries after the lives they claim to describe. But myths matter too. For the Romans, their city was born from violence and abandonment. Twins cast into the river, a she-wolf in the wild, a murdered brother, a sacred boundary marked in blood. Romulus, the first king, was not simply a founder, he was a warning. Rome imagined itself as a child of exposure, hunger, war, and divine favor. Its first breath was survival. Its first law was boundary. Its first crime was fratricide. And perhaps that is why the story still feels true, even if the details dissolve beneath the scrutiny of archaeology. Because Rome was always two things at once: a city of law and a city of violence, a city of farmers and a city of conquerors, a city that spoke endlessly of liberty, while building one of the greatest systems of domination the world had ever seen. The question is not simply how Rome took over everything, The question is how a community that began so small came to imagine that the world itself could be organized around its will. The answer was not one thing. It was not just military genius. It was not just geography. It was not just brutality. Discipline, luck, slavery, roads, money, myth, or law. It was all of them, layered over centuries, like the soil of an ancient tell, each generation building upon the buried decisions of those who came earlier. Rome expanded because it could turn enemies into manpower. It endured because defeat rarely taught it surrender. It transformed because it was never too proud to learn from those it conquered. It ruled because it made domination feel administrative, sacred, inevitable. And it collapsed because the very machinery that made it powerful became too vast, too expensive, too violent, too dependent on constant extraction, constant loyalty, constant belief. But collapse, like origin, is never simple. No single barbarian sword ended Rome. No single emperor ruined it. No single battle explains it. The Roman world did not fall like a tower struck at its base. It changed shape, region by region, decade by decade. Some cities shrank, some frontiers broke, some elites adapted, some armies mutinied, some farmers paid taxes to new masters and continued their lives beneath different banners. The empire in the West fragmented, while the Eastern Empire endured, transformed, and carried Roman statecraft into another age. Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made, what lost tablets may surface from waterlogged forts, what buried cemeteries may yield through genomic data, what climate proxies may reveal about drought, plague, migration, and harvest failure. We are still answerless, adrift to ponder the long road between a hut on the Palatine and the silence of abandoned forums. Yet the ruins speak. They speak in roads still running straight across the landscape, in concrete harbors swallowed by the sea, in amphitheaters where grass grows between the seats, in legal phrases still echoing through modern courts, in languages descended from Latin, in cities that were once camps, in borders first hardened by imperial fear, in the dream, still dangerous, that a single order might rule many peoples beneath one system. Rome is not dead, because Rome was never only a place. It was an idea of power, a machine for belonging and exclusion, a promise that civilization could be built by discipline, law, violence, memory, and stone, a warning that even the greatest systems are mortal. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as we begin, write down where you are watching from and the local time where you are, because somewhere tonight, beneath electric lights and modern skies, we are still gathering around the old fire, still listening for footsteps on the road, still wondering how empires rise, how they rule, and why. In the end, they fall. There is a moment, deep beneath the later city, where Rome stops being a legend and becomes a stain in the earth. Not marble, not bronze, not the proud face of empire stamped onto coins, just the dark oval of an ancient post-hole, the line of a vanished wall, the ash of a hearth, the imprint of a life pressed into clay and soil. Archaeology has a way of humbling even the loudest civilizations. It strips them back, layer by layer, until kings become pottery fragments and national destinies become patterns of drainage, diet, burial, and building. Beneath the grand temples, beneath the paved roads and crowded forums, beneath the stones polished by centuries of sandals, Rome began as timber, thatch, smoke, animal dung, and human fear. On the Palatine Hill, the high ridge overlooking the river valley, excavators uncovered traces of early huts. These were not palaces. They were small oval dwellings, framed with wood, packed with clay, roofed with reeds or straw. Their plans resemble simple houses known from urns shaped like huts, miniature containers used to hold cremated remains. These strange little funerary vessels preserve, in miniature, the architecture of a vanished age. Doorways, roof beams, pegs, thatched coverings. A house for the dead, modeled on the houses of the living. Here, the Roman story touches something real. People were living on these hills in the Iron Age. They kept animals. They buried their dead. They watched the river. They tended fires against the cold and the dark. They knew the sound of wolves, perhaps not as mythic mothers, but as real creatures beyond the fence line. They would have seen the marshes below catching mist at dawn, the slopes cut by pathways, the sky filled with birds, the distant glint of water carrying trade, danger, and rumor. To understand early Rome, one must not imagine a city at all. Imagine a landscape of villages. The Palatine, the Capitoline, the Esquiline, the Quirinal, the Viminal, the Caelian, and the Aventine were not born as parts of one united organism. They were high places scattered across a broken terrain. Between them lay valleys, some damp and unhealthy, some useful for grazing, some crossed by tracks that later became streets. In time, these hill communities appear to have drawn together, not in a single dramatic act, but through a slow fusion of need, ritual, marriage, war, and shared defense. This is where stratigraphic excavation becomes almost poetic. A foundation cut through an older floor, a ritual deposit sealed beneath a later shrine, a burial disturbed by construction. Every layer says that people return to the same places again and again, treating certain points in the landscape as charged with memory. A hut site could become sacred. A grave field could become boundary. A ditch could become a wall. A meeting place could become a forum. The forum itself, that later heart of Roman political life, was once a low, wet valley between hills. Before senators debated there, before generals crossed it in triumph, before statues and basilicas crowded its edges, the area had to be drained. This transformation was not glamorous, but it was revolutionary. To master water was to master the future city. Drainage turned marginal ground into shared ground. Mud became meeting place. Marsh became market. Engineering entered the Roman soul early, not as ornament, but as necessity. The Romans later remembered a line of kings ruling their infant city: Romulus, Numa, Tullus Hostilius, Ancus Marcius, Tarquinius Priscus, Servius Tullius, Tarquinius Superbus, 7 kings, each carrying a particular lesson: war, religion, expansion, the harbor, census, walls, tyranny. Modern historians handle these names carefully, for tradition is not the same as evidence. Still, embedded in the stories may be memories of real transformations, the growth of institutions, the influence of Etruscan elites, the rise of public ritual, the organization of people by wealth and military duty. Rome's early monarchy, whatever its precise shape, belonged to a wider Italian world where kingship, priesthood, warfare, and sacred authority could overlap. Power was not yet the polished machine of later republican politics. It was personal, symbolic, violent, and ritualized. A ruler did not merely command. He interpreted omens. He marked sacred boundaries. He led warriors. He stood between the community and the gods. The Etruscans loom over this period like figures painted on the walls of tombs, vivid but not easily understood. They built rich cities to the north. They traded widely. They worked metal with skill. They practiced elaborate divination. Their language remains only partly understood, written in inscriptions that give us names, offerings, and glimpses, but rarely the full inner life of their world. Rome absorbed much from them: symbols of authority, religious practices, architectural techniques, the spectacle of power. Even the image of the ruler elevated above ordinary men may have passed through Etruscan hands. In the old accounts, Rome's last king, Tarquinius Superbus, ruled with arrogance and cruelty. His family's violence provoked revolt. Kingship was expelled. The Republic was born. Like all foundation stories, this one is polished by later memory. It explains the Roman hatred of monarchy. It gives moral shape to political change. It tells the Romans who they wished to be: free citizens standing against tyranny, even when their society remained marked by hierarchy, debt, patriarchy, and domination. But something did change. At some point in the late 6th century BC, Rome began moving away from kingship toward a system ruled by magistrates, councils, assemblies, and aristocratic competition. Power became annual, divided, contested. No single man was meant to hold it permanently. 2 consuls replaced 1 king. Public office became a ladder of ambition. Noble families competed for honor, but within rules that were supposed to protect the community from tyranny. For Rome was never a peaceful republic of equal voices. It was born into conflict. Patricians and plebeians, creditors and debtors, generals and farmers, clans and clients, sacred law and hunger. The struggle of the orders shaped Rome from within, as common citizens demanded protection, representation, and dignity from aristocrats who believed power was their inheritance. The Republic hardened itself through argument as much as through war. This may be one of Rome's deepest secrets. It learned to turn conflict into structure. Instead of shattering immediately under pressure, Rome created offices, compromises, customs, and rituals that allowed tension to continue without always becoming civil destruction. Tribunes of the people emerged as defenders of plebeian rights. Written laws were displayed. Assemblies gained weight. The elite did not surrender easily, but Rome's political system learned to bend just enough to survive. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. We do not hear the voice of the poor woman grinding grain before sunrise. We do not hear the indebted farmer watching his field fail. We do not hear the child carrying water up the hill, or the shepherd staring down at smoke rising from a neighboring settlement. The written tradition belongs largely to those who came later, those who already knew Rome had become great and wished to see greatness in its cradle. The earth gives us something quieter. It tells us that Rome was not inevitable. It was made from huts and graves, made from borrowed customs, made from drainage channels and sacred boundaries, made from fear of kings and hunger for land, made from families who remembered insults for generations, made from farmers who could be soldiers, soldiers who could become voters, and voters who could be summoned again to fight. In those early centuries, there was no guarantee that Rome would rise above the other towns of Latium. It might have remained one settlement among many, its name preserved only in a broken inscription, its gods forgotten, its hills absorbed by some other power. Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made, but what we possess already is enough to reveal the astonishing truth. The empire began not with certainty, but with improvisation, not with marble, but with mud, not with world conquest, but with a community learning, slowly and dangerously, how to bind itself together before turning its face toward the lands beyond. The first empire Rome ever built was not across the sea, not among the islands, not in the golden cities of the East, but in the hard, stubborn, contested heart of Italy. It began with neighbors. That is the thing easily forgotten when gazing upon maps of later Roman power, when red spreads from Britain to Egypt, from the Atlantic to the Euphrates, as though conquest were a storm moving naturally across the world. Rome's first wars were intimate. They were fought against peoples who knew the same hills, crossed the same rivers, prayed to familiar gods, and understood the same language of cattle raids, boundary stones, harvests, oaths, revenge, and honor. The early republic did not wake one morning and decide to rule everything. It was pulled into struggle by the brutal logic of proximity. A town that did not defend its fields lost them. A community that did not secure allies became prey. A city that could not feed its citizens risked hunger, revolt, and humiliation. In central Italy, survival itself became a school of power. Around Rome lay the Latin towns, the Sabines, the Equi, the Volsci, the Etruscans, and many smaller communities whose names now flicker like sparks in ancient texts. Each had its own sanctuaries, leaders, memories, and claims to land. The landscape was not empty. Every valley had a history. Every pasture mattered. Every road could become an invasion route. Warfare was seasonal, repetitive, and deeply rooted in the agricultural calendar. Men who sowed grain might later take up shields. Men who guarded livestock might be summoned to defend a town wall. The farmer and the fighter were not separate beings. They lived in the same body. The Roman army of this age was not yet the professional machine of later centuries. It was a citizen force, drawn from men with property, obligations, and status. To serve was not merely to fight, it was to belong. Weapons and armor were tied to wealth. The richer man might stand in heavier equipment, the poorer man in lighter role. And the census of the state became, in effect, a map of military usefulness. Rome counted its citizens because counting meant knowing who could fight, who could pay, who could stand in the line when danger came down from the hills. There is a severe honesty in this arrangement. Citizenship was not abstract. It was physical. It had weight, bronze, iron, leather, sweat, shieldwood, marching dust. The Republic asked men to bleed for land, law, family, and gods. In return, it gave them a share, unequal and often contested, in the Roman community. This connection between military duty and political identity would become one of the great engines of expansion. Rome's wars against its Italian neighbors were often remembered through heroic tales. Champions fighting single combat, dictators called from the plow, betrayals punished, vows made to gods in moments of terror. These stories are difficult to untangle from later invention, but they preserve a Roman truth. The Republic imagined itself as a society tested by crisis and purified through discipline. It admired endurance more than brilliance. It trusted repetition more than inspiration. A defeat was not the end of the story. It was evidence that the state must return, reorganize, and fight again. In this, Rome became terrifying. Many ancient states could win battles. Rome learned how to survive losing them. The Gallic sack of Rome, traditionally placed in the early 4th century BC, burned itself into Roman memory like a wound that never healed. Warriors from beyond the Apennines entered the city, humiliated it, and left behind a lesson that later Romans would retell with fear and fury. Whether every detail of the tradition can be accepted is another matter. Still, the psychological force of the event was immense. Rome learned that walls, vigilance, and military reform were not luxuries. They were the difference between memory and extinction. After that darkness, the Republic grew harder. Its struggle with the Latin League brought a decisive transformation. Rome did not simply crush all neighboring Latin communities into ruin. It reorganized them. Some received citizenship. Some received limited rights. Some became allies with obligations. Some retained local identity while being bound to Roman military command. This was not mercy in the modern sense. It was strategy. Rome discovered that conquest could be made more durable when the conquered were given a stake, however partial, in the system that had mastered them. This was one of the great Roman inventions, not conquest alone, but incorporation. A defeated enemy might become a future soldier. A rival town might become a supplier of manpower. A former battlefield might become a colony. A road might fasten the new possession to the old center like a tendon connecting bone to muscle. Rome extended itself not merely by taking land, but by constructing relationships of obligation. Different communities received different statuses, and this inequality was useful. It prevented unity against Rome. It gave local elites reasons to cooperate. It created ladders of ambition leading toward Roman favor. The roads mattered beyond measure. The Via Appia, begun in the late 4th century BC, was not simply a path of stone. It was a political weapon laid across the landscape. Roads allowed troops to move faster, messages to travel, colonies to remain connected, and conquered territories to feel the steady pressure of the Roman state. They cut through geography with a clarity that was almost ideological. Hills, marshes, rivers, and distance could be challenged. The road said that Rome intended to return, and return it did. The Samnite Wars dragged Rome into the mountains of central and southern Italy, into a world very different from the plains and low hills of Latium. The Samnites were not weak villagers waiting to be organized by a superior power. They were formidable, adaptive, and deeply rooted in harsh upland terrain. They understood ambush, movement, and the difficulty of fighting among ridges and passes. Rome suffered. Rome learned. Rome altered its military formations, moving away from older rigid models toward more flexible units better suited to broken ground. Lithic analysis may tell us of tools and earlier ages, but the study of weapons, fortifications, camps, and battlefield landscapes tells another story of adaptation. Rome's genius was rarely pure invention. It was selection under pressure. What worked was kept. What failed was changed. The enemy became a teacher, though often an unwilling one. By the end of these long Italian wars, Rome had become something more than a city-state. It had become the central organizer of a vast military federation. Allies supplied troops. Colonies guarded strategic points. Roads stitched territories together. Latin rights, Roman citizenship, local autonomy, and military obligation formed a complex web. The Republic had created a structure that could mobilize enormous manpower compared with many of its rivals. This was not yet world empire, but the skeleton was there, a state that could absorb punishment, a political culture that honored conquest, a military system that drew strength from citizens and allies, a habit of turning defeated enemies into future instruments, a belief that Roman security required Roman expansion. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. We do not know the thoughts of the Samnite warrior looking down from a mountain pass at Roman shields below. We do not know the grief inside Latin towns whose independence faded behind treaties and obligations. We do not know how many farmers marched away and never returned, their names lost before any monument could hold them. The maps show Roman growth as clean lines. The earth knows better. It was smoke, hunger, smashed gates, winter camps, broken treaties, votive offerings, wounded animals, mothers waiting, and men swearing that next year, surely, the war would end. Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made. But by the 3rd century B.C., a new force had appeared in Italy. Not merely a city, not merely a republic. Something stranger, more disciplined, more patient, and more dangerous. Rome had found its teeth. Across the water stood another power, older in wisdom, richer in trade, and far more comfortable upon the sea, Carthage. To Rome the name would become a wound, a nightmare, a rival carved into memory with the sharp edge of terror. But Carthage was not born as a villain in Rome's story. It was a city of merchants, sailors, farmers, priests, craftsmen, and nobles, set on the North African coast, looking outward across the Mediterranean with the calm confidence of those who understood harbors, winds, islands, silver, timber, grain, and distant markets. Where Rome had learned war among hills and fields, Carthage had learned survival by water. Its ships moved between Africa, Sicily, Sardinia, Spain, and beyond the pillars at the edge of the known world. Its merchants followed routes older than Roman ambition. Its wealth came from exchange, agriculture, tribute, and maritime control. Its leaders understood that a harbor could be as powerful as a fortress, that a fleet could be a wall, that a chain of ports could become an empire without looking like one on land. When Rome first looked beyond Italy, it did not enter an empty sea. It entered a world already claimed. Sicily became the spark. That great island, lying between Italy and Africa, was not merely a place of fields and cities. It was the hinge of the central Mediterranean. Greek cities stood there with old temples and fierce traditions. Carthaginian influence pressed from the west. Mercenary bands, local tyrants, and shifting alliances made the island a furnace of ambition. Whoever controlled Sicily could threaten Italy, command sea lanes, and draw grain from one of the richest agricultural landscapes in the region. Rome had conquered Italy, but sea power was a different language. The Romans were not natural masters of the waves. They had ships, sailors, and coastal experience. But they were not Carthage. They did not possess the same inherited maritime culture, the same generations of naval knowledge. the same ease with long-distance trade and fleet command. Yet this is where the Roman pattern appears again, severe and astonishing. Rome confronted something it did not fully understand, then learned with brutal speed. Ancient writers claimed that the Romans copied a captured Carthaginian warship to build their own fleet. Whether the story is exact or polished by tradition, it preserves a deeper truth. Rome was willing to imitate. Rome did not treat borrowing as shame. A useful enemy invention could be studied, reproduced, and turned against its maker. The sea itself became another battlefield to be organized, disciplined, and forced into Roman categories. There was, however, a problem. Carthage knew naval warfare. Rome knew infantry combat. So Rome tried to turn sea battles into land battles. The famous boarding device, often called a crow in translation, was said to have allowed Roman soldiers to grapple enemy vessels and storm across onto their decks. The sea did not become gentle because of this. Storms smashed fleets. Poor seamanship killed thousands. Warships were expensive, fragile, and hungry for trained crews. But the Roman instinct was clear. If the enemy ruled through maneuver, Rome would seek contact. If Carthage excelled in sailing, Rome would bring swords. The First Punic War was long, grinding, and costly beyond anything Rome had experienced. It was not a single heroic contest, but a generation of exhaustion, battles at sea, sieges in Sicily, failed expeditions, shipwrecks, taxes, levies, and stubborn endurance. Carthage relied heavily on skilled commanders, mercenaries, and naval strength. Rome relied on its terrible capacity to replace losses and continue. Here the Mediterranean learned something about Rome that Italy already knew. Rome did not accept defeat as final. A fleet destroyed could be rebuilt. An army trapped could be replaced. A disaster could be folded into memory and answered with another levy. This was not invincibility. It was persistence raised into statecraft. Other powers counted cost and reconsidered. Rome counted cost and demanded more. When Carthage finally yielded Sicily, Rome had crossed a threshold. For the first time, it held territory outside Italy. Sicily became Rome's first overseas possession, a place from which grain, taxes, and strategic power could be drawn. The Republic now had to govern beyond its original world. Provincial administration began not as a grand design, but as an answer to conquest. Rome had taken land separated by water. Now it needed officials, revenue systems, courts, garrisons, and habits of command that could function far from the citizen assemblies and sacred spaces of the city. The victory did not bring peace. It brought resentment. Carthage, wounded but not destroyed, turned toward Spain, where silver mines, manpower, and new territories could restore its strength. There, under the Barcid family, Carthaginian power took on a sharper, more military form. Hamilcar, Hasdrubal. And then Hannibal built a base of wealth and loyalty that Rome watched with growing alarm. Spain was not merely compensation, it became a forge. Then came Hannibal. Few names in ancient history carry such force. He was not simply a general. He was the living embodiment of Roman fear. When he marched from Spain, crossed the mountains, passed through lands of ice, rock, and ambush, and descended into Italy with elephants and hardened troops, he did what should have been impossible. He brought the war into Rome's own body. The Second Punic War was Rome's nightmare made real. at Trebia, at Lake Trasimene, and most terribly, at Cannae. Roman armies were destroyed with a completeness that still chills military historians. Cannae was not merely defeat, it was annihilation through intelligence, patience, and encirclement. Tens of thousands of Roman and allied soldiers died on a single day, crushed inside a tactical masterpiece. The Republic stood exposed before a commander who seemed to understand both terrain and human weakness with almost supernatural clarity. Many states would have broken. Rome did not. This is one of the darkest and most revealing facts in Roman history. After Cannae, when grief must have filled countless houses, when allied communities considered revolt, when Hannibal stood undefeated in Italy, Rome refused negotiation. It armed younger men. It called upon slaves. It punished disloyal allies. It avoided Hannibal when it had to, harassed him when it could, and fought elsewhere when direct confrontation promised ruin. The war became global by the standards of its age. Spain, Sicily, Africa, and the Italian peninsula all mattered. Rome learned to strike at the foundations of Hannibal's strength. In Spain, Roman commanders slowly broke Carthaginian power. In Africa, Scipio carried the war to Carthage itself. Hannibal was recalled from Italy, not because Rome had defeated him there, but because Rome had learned to attack the world that sustained him. At Zama, the great contest turned. Carthage was beaten. Its fleet was reduced. Its military freedom was chained. Rome emerged from the war scarred, traumatized, and transformed. The Mediterranean balance had shifted forever. Carthage survived for a time, but Rome no longer saw it as a rival to be managed. It became a memory to be feared, and Roman fear, once fed, could become extermination. In the Third Punic War, Carthage was besieged, stormed, and destroyed. Its people were killed, enslaved, scattered. Its city burned. The old maritime queen was reduced to ruins beneath the gaze of the rising power it had failed to break. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden beneath the soil of North Africa and the seabed of the central Mediterranean. Ship rams, amphorae, harbor works, burnt layers, human remains, and battlefield traces continue to speak in fragments. They tell us that empire was not born in speeches alone. It was made in shipyards, storms, massacres, treaties, taxes, and silence. Rome crossed the sea and found its equal. Then it destroyed it. And after Carthage, the waters no longer looked like a boundary. They looked like a road. The Old World did not become Roman in a single generation. It yielded in fragments, a treaty here, a fortress there, a royal hostage raised in a Roman household, a city punished, a harbor taxed, a road extended, a rival aristocrat flattered, a temple spared, a king renamed friend and ally of the Roman people, until the day friendship no longer served Roman interest. This was the genius of expansion. Rome rarely announced itself as a hungry empire at the beginning of a war. It spoke instead of protection, obligation, insult, alliance, piracy, disorder, and defense. Roman armies marched as though compelled by necessity. Roman senators debated as though conquest had been forced upon them by the dangerous behavior of others. Yet the result, again and again, was the same. More land, more tribute, more captives, more glory, more roads leading outward from the city beside the Tiber. After Carthage, there was no power in the western Mediterranean strong enough to block Rome for long. Spain became one of the great proving grounds of Roman violence. It was not conquered quickly, nor simply, The peninsula was vast, mountainous, mineral-rich, and fiercely defended by communities that knew their terrain with intimate precision. Rome wanted its silver, its manpower, its strategic depth, and its security. But wanting was not the same as possessing. In Spain, Roman commanders found that conquest could become a slow bleeding. Fortified hill settlements resisted. Guerrilla fighters vanished into the landscape. Campaigns dragged across seasons and decades. The Celtiberians and Lusitanians did not behave like pieces on a Roman board. They adapted, negotiated, ambushed, betrayed, endured. Some leaders became legends. Some towns became symbols of defiance. The siege of Numantia, where starvation and resistance fused into one terrible memory, revealed the cost of Roman certainty. When Rome could not persuade or swiftly defeat, it could surround, isolate, and wait. Rome was patient when patience promised ownership. The East was different. There, Rome encountered kingdoms born from the shattered empire of Alexander. Macedon, Syria, Pergamon, Egypt, Rhodes, and the Greek city-states lived in a world of courts, philosophers, mercenary armies, dynastic marriages, sacred games, old rivalries, and polished diplomacy. The cities of Greece possessed a cultural prestige Rome could not ignore. Roman nobles admired Greek literature, sculpture, philosophy, and education, even as Roman soldiers stripped Greek sanctuaries, seized Greek art, and forced Greek communities into obedience. This contradiction never troubled Rome as much as it should have. Rome could kneel before Greek genius and still chain Greek bodies. The conquest of the eastern Mediterranean was wrapped in the language of liberation. Rome claimed to free Greek cities from kings. It announced freedom in public ceremonies. It allowed some communities to believe that Roman intervention meant autonomy restored beneath the gaze of grateful gods. Yet freedom under Roman protection had limits. A city might govern itself until it chose wrongly. A league might deliberate until its decisions challenged Roman authority. A king might rule until his power threatened the balance Rome preferred. The world became Roman through ambiguity. Rome did not always need to annex immediately. Influence could come before direct rule. Tribute could precede provinces. Arbitration could become command. A request for help could open a corridor for permanent interference. The Roman state was extraordinarily skilled at allowing weaker powers to step into dependence, then redefining dependence as duty. Macedon fell. The old homeland of Philip and Alexander was reduced, reorganized, and eventually made a province. Greek resistance continued in waves, but the outcome grew clearer with every Roman intervention. The sack of Corinth in 146 BC, the same year Carthage was destroyed, marked one of history's great symbolic turns. In the West, Rome erased its maritime rival. In the East, Rome shattered one of the great Greek cities. Two worlds, Punic and Greek, burned beneath the same expanding republic. Art flowed into Rome. So did money. So did slaves. The conquest of the Mediterranean transformed the Roman elite. Victorious generals returned with treasure on a scale earlier generations could scarcely have imagined. Triumphs became theatrical displays of world mastery. Captive kings, exotic animals, painted panels, heaps of weapons, gold vessels, statues, and chained prisoners moved through the city streets before crowds drunk on spectacle. The triumph was not merely celebration, it was political warfare inside Rome itself. A commander who conquered abroad gained terrifying prestige at home. Empire began to change the republic from within. Landowners grew richer, small farmers struggled. Slaves captured in war were poured into Italy. Working estates, mines, households, workshops, and fields. Wealth from provinces distorted old balances. Senators competed for commands not merely for honor, but for profit. Governors saw provinces as opportunities for enrichment. Tax collectors, merchants, financiers, and contractors followed the armies like ravens after battle. The Roman world was becoming larger than Roman institutions had been designed to manage. Yet on the surface, the city glittered. Temples rose, basilicas appeared. Greek teachers educated Roman sons. Philosophers debated in elite houses. The old austerity praised by Roman moralists gave way to luxury. Imported marble, silver tableware, Eastern perfumes, and villas looking over cultivated landscapes worked by enslaved labor. Conservatives complained that conquest had corrupted the ancestors' virtues. They were not entirely wrong, though nostalgia is often a mask worn by those who benefited from the corruption they mourned. The conquered also changed Rome spiritually. Gods traveled with soldiers, merchants, slaves, and diplomats. Rome had always been open to divine adoption. Its religion was not narrow in the manner of later exclusive creeds. A foreign deity might be feared, honored, translated, or invited. In moments of crisis, sacred objects and cults could be brought into the city to secure divine favor. As Rome expanded, its ritual universe grew crowded. Greek gods merged with Roman ones. Eastern goddesses attracted worshippers. Prophecies, mysteries, healing cults, and private devotions moved through the empire's arteries. To conquer a people was never only to take its land, it was to bring its dead, gods, memories, and nightmares into your own house. Gaul, too, pulled Rome northward. The lands beyond the Alps were imagined as dangerous, wealthy, and unstable. Roman memory still carried fear of Celtic warriors. Trade routes, migration, alliance politics, and military ambition drew Roman attention across the mountains. Southern Gaul became a Roman zone before the great conquest of the north. Roads and colonies secured movement between Italy and Spain. What began as strategic connection became permanent expansion. The pattern repeated with variations. First concern, then intervention, then road, then garrison, then province, then memory rewritten, so that Roman rule seemed to have been the natural outcome all along. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. Beneath provincial towns lie the earlier settlements, whose people had different names for the rivers and hills. Beneath Latin inscriptions are older languages fading from public stone. Beneath Roman temples are local shrines where offerings were once made in ways no Roman priest fully understood. Archaeology restores some of this lost complexity through ceramics, burials, coins, pollen samples, settlement plans, and the stubborn survival of native traditions beneath imperial forms. The world did not simply become Roman. It negotiated, resisted, adapted, and endured becoming Roman. Some communities sought Roman citizenship eagerly. Some elites dressed their ambition in Roman style. Some soldiers from conquered lands served beneath Roman standards and returned home changed. Some peoples rebelled again and again, unwilling to let the eagle become the only sky above them. Romanization was not a single flood washing all color away. It was a long and uneven weathering, sometimes embraced, sometimes imposed, sometimes only painted on the surface. By the late Republic, Rome commanded a Mediterranean world of astonishing diversity. Spain's mines, Sicily's grain, African estates, Greek cities, Macedonian roads, Asian revenues, Gallic corridors, and allied kingdoms all fed the rising power. The Republic had not merely taken territory, it had built an imperial system while pretending its old civic virtues still governed events. But the old city-state was gone. In its place stood a vast dominion ruled by men whose imaginations had been enlarged by conquest and poisoned by competition. Rome had taken the world into its hands, but the weight of it was beginning to bend the bones of the Republic, and somewhere in that bending, the future was already gathering its weapons. The Republic was built by citizen soldiers, but it was broken by armies that learned to love their commanders more than the state. At first, the bond between military service and civic life seemed like one of Rome's greatest strengths. A man who owned land had a reason to defend it. A farmer called to war might curse the summons, sharpen his tools into weapons, leave his fields behind, and march beneath the standards with the knowledge that his household, his gods, and his status were tied to the survival of the Republic. The army was not an alien force imposed upon society. It was society armed, but empire changed the meaning of service. When wars were near and seasonal, the old pattern could function. Men marched, fought, returned, harvested, repaired, and resumed their lives. But when Rome's wars stretched across Spain, Greece, Africa, Asia, and the northern frontiers, service became longer, harsher, and more distant. A farmer could not easily maintain his field while campaigning for years in a mountain province or guarding a road far from home. Land neglected became land lost. Debt grew quietly. Wealthy neighbors bought up small plots. The soil of Italy itself began to record the consequences of conquest. The Republic needed soldiers, but the old class of independent farmers was under strain. At the same time, massive numbers of enslaved people flowed into Italy through war. They labored on large estates, in mines, in households, and in workshops. Their presence enriched those who already possessed land and capital, while making life more difficult for poor free citizens. A Roman noble could buy captives in quantity and turn conquered bodies into agricultural profit. A small farmer could not compete so easily with estates worked by people who had been stripped of freedom. Rome conquered abroad, and the countryside at home began to change. This was not invisible to the Romans. Some saw it clearly and with alarm. Reformers argued that the health of the Republic depended on restoring land to citizens, rebuilding the class of smallholders who had once filled the legions, and checking the greed of the wealthy. But land was never merely land. It was status, memory, inheritance, and power. To challenge elite holdings was to strike at the heart of aristocratic wealth. The names of Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus still echo through this crisis. They were aristocrats by birth, but they turned toward popular reform and the tribunate as an instrument against entrenched senatorial privilege. Their efforts to redistribute public land and address social imbalance exposed the Republic's deepest wound. Rome had institutions for competition, but not for unlimited competition. It had rituals for conflict, but the stakes had grown too large. When political defeat began to feel like extinction, violence entered the city not as accident, but as method. The deaths of the Gracchi were more than murders. They were omens. The sacred boundary around political life had been crossed. Clubs, Mobs, senatorial fury, street violence, and public killing showed that the Republic's old restraints were cracking. Once blood had been spilled in political struggle, later men could remember the precedent. They could condemn it in speeches and imitate it in practice. The army was changing as well. By the late 2nd century BC, the need for manpower and the pressure of long wars encouraged new solutions. Gaius Marius, a towering figure of ambition and military ability, opened recruitment more fully to the poor, men who lacked the property qualifications traditionally associated with service. These soldiers had little land to return to, little wealth to protect, and every reason to look to their general for reward, pay, plunder, retirement grants, and future settlement became central to their hopes. This was practical. It was also dangerous. The state could recruit men who needed war to become anything at all. Generals could promise what the Senate resisted giving. Soldiers might begin to see their commander, not the Republic, as the man who would secure their future. The bond of loyalty shifted, slowly but faithfully, from civic duty to personal patronage. The Roman army became more professional, more disciplined, more experienced, and more permanent. It became better at conquering. It also became better at deciding Roman politics. Marius himself rose through victories, especially against threats from the north that terrified Italy. The Cimbri and Teutones had shaken Roman confidence, and Marius restored it through military success. The people loved saviors. Soldiers loved commanders who brought victory. Political office became entangled with military glory in ways the Republic could no longer safely contain. Then came Sulla. Lucius Cornelius Sulla revealed the nightmare hidden inside the new military order. During a struggle over command against Mithridates of Pontus, Sulla did what had once been unthinkable. He marched his army on Rome. Roman soldiers crossed into the sacred political space of their own city under the command of a Roman general. The Republic had created armies for defense and conquest. Now one of those armies became an instrument against Rome itself. Something ancient died in that march. Sulla eventually seized power, declared enemies of the state, posted lists of men to be killed, confiscated property, and reshaped institutions through terror. The proscriptions were not only political purges, they were social earthquakes. A name on a list meant death, reward for the killer, and property transferred to loyalists. Violence became bureaucratic. Murder became public policy. The elite learned that political victory could include exterminating opponents and enriching friends. Sulla claimed to restore the Republic. The phrase would be used again. It often meant the opposite. He strengthened senatorial authority, weakened popular instruments, and then did the astonishing thing of retiring from supreme power. But the damage had already entered the bloodstream. The lesson was not that dictatorship could heal the Republic. The lesson was that an ambitious man with loyal troops could force the state to obey. The armies remembered. The politicians remembered. The young men watching remembered. Rome's expansion had produced commanders with experience, money, clients, veterans, and reputations stretching across provinces. A general returning from the east or the west might command not only troops, but networks of debt, gratitude, fear, and expectation. Veterans wanted land. Public contractors wanted profit. Provincial allies wanted favor. Enemies wanted protection. The Senate wanted control, but often lacked the means to enforce obedience when faced with armed prestige. This was the paradox. The more Rome conquered, the more it empowered individuals who could threaten Rome. The Republic had been designed for a city-state of competing aristocrats, not for military dynasts commanding legions hardened in distant wars. Its offices were annual, but military loyalty could last for years. Its laws assumed restraint, but glory rewarded excess. Its culture praised service to the community, but triumphs taught commanders to imagine themselves as chosen by fortune and the gods. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. We know the names of generals, tribunes, and consuls, but not the full inner world of the ordinary legionary. What did loyalty mean to a man who had marched through heat, snow, thirst, and terror under the same commander for years? Did the Senate feel like a sacred guardian of the Republic, or a distant club of wealthy men who would deny him land when the campaigning ended? Did Rome mean law, or did Rome mean the general who knew his name and promised him a farm? The answerless dead lie scattered across battlefields, roadsides, colonial settlements, and forgotten cemeteries. Their bones, when found, speak through isotopic analysis, trauma studies, burial patterns, and the mute evidence of labor and violence. Their lives became the leverage by which great men moved history. The army did not break the state because soldiers hated Rome. It broke the state because soldiers needed Rome to pay, and generals learned how to stand between the soldier and the Republic. Once that happened, law became fragile. The sword had entered politics, and it would not leave willingly. Julius Caesar did not appear from nowhere. He rose from a republic already fevered, already sleepless, already haunted by the sound of marching feet inside its own walls. He was born into an old patrician family that possessed ancient prestige but not unlimited wealth. His name carried ancestry, ritual memory, and a claimed descent from divine blood. Yet noble birth alone no longer guaranteed supremacy in Rome. The city had become too vast, too competitive, too drenched in provincial money and military ambition for lineage by itself to command obedience. Caesar understood this world with unsettling clarity. He was brilliant, reckless, charming, patient when patience served him, daring when delay became dangerous, and almost theatrical in his instinct for public emotion. He knew that Roman politics was not conducted only in the Senate House. It lived in streets, courts, temples, debts, games, funerals, triumphs, rumors, and memory. A man seeking power had to speak to the people, flatter the elite, reward friends, frighten enemies, and turn every humiliation into future advantage. He also understood debt. Debt was not merely financial, it was social. To owe money in Rome could be ruin, but to distribute favors, promises, protection, and expectation was to weave a net around men. Caesar borrowed enormously, spent magnificently, staged games, cultivated crowds, and presented himself as a champion of popular rights against narrow aristocratic arrogance. His enemies saw danger in him early. They were not wrong, yet Caesar alone could not have shattered the Republic. The structure had been cracking for generations. Men like Marius and Sulla had already shown that armies could decide politics. The Gracchi had shown that reform could end in blood. Provincial commands had shown that conquest could make individuals richer than the state could comfortably control. The question was not whether another crisis would come. The question was whose hands would shape it. In Caesar's youth, another giant dominated Rome. Pompey had won fame young, raising armies, defeating enemies, and gathering a reputation that outgrew normal political rules. He fought in the east, reorganized kingdoms, subdued pirates, and returned with enormous prestige. He was celebrated as a bringer of order, a man whose victories stretched Roman authority across lands once governed by kings. His veterans expected land. His arrangements in the east needed approval. His dignity demanded recognition. Then there was Crassus, the richest man in Rome, whose fortune and influence could move elections, careers, and loyalties. He had helped suppress the great slave uprising led by Spartacus, a war that terrified Italy because it revealed the violence buried beneath Rome's slave economy. Crassus possessed money on a scale that made politics pliable. He did not have Pompey's glory, but he had the power of gold, obligation, and calculation. Caesar brought these forces together in what later generations would call the First Triumvirate. It was not an official office. It was an arrangement among ambitious men who recognized that the formal machinery of the Republic could be bent by private cooperation. Pompey had prestige. Crassus had wealth. Caesar had political genius and hunger. Together, they could overpower resistance. This was one of the Republic's fatal humiliations. The state still existed. Elections were held. Magistrates took office. Priests performed rituals. Senators spoke in grave tones of tradition. But beneath the surface, the true decisions increasingly came from personal alliances, armed clients, bribery, pressure, and the knowledge that law without force was only an appeal to conscience. Caesar secured the consulship, then the command that would make him immortal and unforgivable. Gaul? To Roman eyes, Gaul was not a single nation, but a vast, complex world of tribes, warriors, settlements, sacred places, trade routes, rivalries, and shifting alliances. It held wealth, manpower, and danger. It also offered Caesar something more precious than any single province. It offered years of command, years of soldiers, years of victory reports, years of plunder, years in which he could transform himself from politician into conqueror. The Gallic War was presented as defense, stabilization, and punishment of threats. It became a vast conquest. Caesar moved with speed and ferocity across rivers, forests, plains, and fortified settlements. He wrote about his campaigns in clear, controlled prose that made his own decisions seem inevitable and rational. His commentaries were not neutral history. They were weapons made of words. Through them, Caesar spoke to Rome while still in the field, shaping opinion, justifying violence, and building an image of calm mastery. Archaeology gives us a harsher landscape. Siege works, burnt settlements, mass graves, weapons, coins, fortifications, traces of movement and destruction. The conquest of Gaul was not merely a story of Roman discipline overcoming barbarian chaos. It was a brutal collision between a militarized republic and diverse societies fighting, negotiating, fragmenting, and sometimes uniting under unbearable pressure. Vercingetorix, the Arvernian leader, became the great symbol of resistance. He understood that Rome's strength lay not simply in battle, but in logistics, roads, engineering, discipline, and the relentless return of organized force. His strategy of scorched earth and coalition warfare pushed Caesar hard. At Alesia, where Roman siege lines encircled the Gallic stronghold, and then additional outer defenses faced a relief army, the Roman talent for engineering became almost monstrous. The battlefield turned into a landscape of ditches, stakes, towers, walls, hunger, and desperation. Alesia was not just a military victory. It was Rome's method made visible in earth and timber: contain the enemy, control movement, organize space, endure pressure, turn labor into domination, let hunger fight beside the legionary. When Vercingetorix surrendered, Caesar's glory became immense. His soldiers were loyal. His enemies in Rome were frightened. His wealth and prestige had become too large for ordinary political reintegration. The Senate, led by men who feared him and defended their own vision of the Republic, demanded that he surrender command before standing for office. Caesar knew that without legal protection, prosecution and ruin awaited. The conflict became a test of whether the Republic could command the man it had allowed to become indispensable to his army. Then came the river. The Rubicon was not grand in size, but it was immense in meaning. To cross it with an army was to violate the boundary between provincial command and the sacred political heart of Italy. Caesar crossed, whether or not he spoke the famous words attributed to him. The act itself said enough. A Roman general had chosen civil war. Italy trembled. Pompey and many senators withdrew, calculating that Rome itself could not be defended immediately. Caesar moved quickly, presenting himself not as a rebel, but as a defender of rights, dignity, and the tribunes. Again, the language of restoration cloaked the reality of armed coercion. Both sides claimed legitimacy. Both sides invoked the Republic. The Republic itself became the prize fought over by men whose armies made its freedom impossible. Civil war spread across the Roman world. Spain, Greece, Egypt, Africa. Roman fought Roman beneath foreign skies. At Pharsalus, Caesar defeated Pompey. The great Pompey fled to Egypt, where he was murdered upon arrival, his severed head offered as a political gift. Caesar wept, or was said to have wept, when it was presented to him. Perhaps there was grief, perhaps disgust, perhaps calculation. In Roman history, even tears can become part of the theater of power. Caesar pursued victory with a mixture of clemency and ruthlessness. He pardoned some enemies, defeated others, and accumulated honors that made monarchy seem close, even if the word king remained poisonous. Dictator, perpetual authority, statues, sacred honors, his face on coins, his person elevated beyond republican limits. To supporters, he was the man who could heal chaos. To enemies, he was the tyrant the ancestors had warned against. On the Ides of March, conspirators struck him down in the Senate's shadow. They imagined that killing the man would restore the Republic. They misunderstood the age. Caesar's blood did not revive liberty. It baptized another war. The assassins had removed a ruler, but not the armies. Debts, ambitions, veterans, inequalities, and imperial pressures that had created him. Rome was too far gone for a dagger to undo what centuries had made. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. What did Caesar truly intend? A monarchy in all but name, a reformed republic under permanent guidance, a new order he had not yet fully shaped. We are answerless, adrift to ponder the mind of a man who wrote himself into history while forcing history to bend around him. His death left Rome staring at an impossible truth. The Republic had feared a king, but it had become unable to live without masters. Augustus understood what Caesar had not lived long enough to perfect. Rome could endure a monarch, if the monarch did not call himself king. The city hated the name of kingship with a hatred polished by centuries of legend. ritual, and aristocratic pride. Rex was a cursed word in Roman political memory. It summoned the last tyrant, the violated household, the expelled dynasty, the oath that no single man should ever again rule over citizens as master. But names can be veils, power can be dressed in old clothing, revolution can enter the city carrying the vocabulary of restoration. The young man who would become Augustus was born Gaius Octavius, far from the commanding aura that later surrounded him. He was not the most obvious heir to the Roman world. He was young, physically unimpressive to some, inexperienced compared with the great soldiers of the age, and surrounded by men who had commanded armies, governed provinces, and survived the furnace of civil war. Yet he possessed something colder than charisma, and more durable than battlefield brilliance. He possessed patience, calculation, and an almost terrifying understanding of appearances. When Caesar's will named him heir, the young Octavian stepped into a world of knives. He claimed the name Caesar. That name was not simply a family designation. It was a weapon, a promise, a banner, and a ghost. Veterans heard it and remembered pay, land, victory, and loyalty. The people heard it and remembered games, generosity, and the murdered dictator. Senators heard it and felt dread. Mark Antony, Caesar's powerful lieutenant, had no intention of yielding the inheritance of influence to a teenager. The assassins still hoped their act had meaning. Rome staggered between revenge, fear, opportunism, and exhaustion. Octavian survived because he did not need to look noble while doing what was necessary. He made alliances, broke them, raised troops, demanded office, and used Caesar's memory like a sacred flame. With Antony and Lepidus, he formed a new three-man regime, more formal and more openly violent than the earlier private alliance of Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus. The proscriptions returned. Lists of the condemned were posted, enemies were killed, properties were seized. Cicero, the great voice of Republican speech, was murdered, his head and hands displayed as trophies of vengeance. The future Augustus was not born clean. He came to power through blood. The civil wars that followed were not merely struggles of personality. They were wars over legitimacy, revenge, money, veterans, land, and the right to define what Rome had become. At Philippi, the forces of Caesar's assassins were defeated. Brutus and Cassius died, and with them died the last serious military hope of restoring the old aristocratic republic by force. But victory did not bring unity. It narrowed the contest. Antony took the east. Octavian built power in the west. Lepidus faded. The Roman world divided itself between two magnetic centers. Antony became associated with Alexandria, with Cleopatra, with Eastern kingship, luxury, and a style of rule that Roman propaganda could paint as dangerous, foreign, and enslaved to passion. Octavian stayed closer to Italy, cultivating the image of defender of Roman tradition, family order, ancestral gods, and Western discipline. The propaganda war mattered. Coins, poems, rumors, speeches, public ceremonies, and legal claims shaped perception. Antony was not simply opposed as a rival Roman. He was transformed into a man corrupted by the East, bewitched by a queen, threatening to move Roman power away from its rightful center. Cleopatra was made into more than an enemy ruler. She became a symbol through which Octavian could attack Antony without admitting that the final war was yet another Roman civil war. At Actium, off the coast of Greece, the struggle reached its turning point. Ships moved across glittering water beneath the pressure of history. Antony and Cleopatra's forces were defeated. The details of the battle have been debated, reshaped, and narrated through the lens of the victors. But the consequence is clear. Octavian's last great rival fell. Egypt, rich, ancient, and heavy with sacred kingship, became the personal prize of the new ruler of Rome. Its grain would feed the city. Its wealth would stabilize the regime. Its queen would become legend. Octavian returned not as king, not openly as dictator, but as the man who had ended civil war. That was his greatest claim. The Roman world was tired of armies in Italy, tired of confiscations, tired of elite feuds becoming universal catastrophe, tired of sons fighting beneath rival standards, tired of speeches about liberty that ended in slaughter. Peace itself became a political miracle, and Octavian made himself its priest. He accepted the title Augustus, a word heavy with sacred elevation. He became princeps, the first man, not king. He claimed to restore the republic, but what he restored was its shell, its ceremonies, its familiar offices, its comforting language. Consuls still existed, the Senate still met, magistrates still held titles. Laws were passed, temples were rebuilt, priests performed ancient rites. The city could look at itself and pretend continuity, yet real power now gathered around one man. Augustus controlled the armies through commands arranged with exquisite care. He controlled key provinces where legions were stationed. He shaped elections, policy, finance, and succession. He presented his supremacy not as domination, but as service. He refused some honors dramatically and accepted others strategically. He turned modesty into theater. He made restraint look like proof that he could be trusted with supremacy. This was monarchy disguised as medicine, and it worked. The Augustan settlement was not a single document or moment, but a living arrangement constantly adjusted to preserve the illusion that Rome remained itself while ensuring that no return to uncontrolled aristocratic warfare would destroy it. Augustus had learned from Caesar's fate. Do not stand too nakedly above the nobles. Do not mock tradition. Do not make the Senate feel useless, even when it is subordinate. Let old forms breathe. Provided they breathe in the direction of imperial power, he rebuilt the city in stone and symbol. Temples rose or were restored. The Forum of Augustus proclaimed vengeance, ancestry, and destiny. The Arapaces presented peace as sacred abundance, with processions of family, priests, children, and ordered fertility carved into stone. Poets gave language to the new age. Virgil sang of Trojan origins and Roman fate. Horace shaped the moral atmosphere of renewed discipline and measured glory. Livy wrote the story of Rome from its beginnings, filling the present with ancestral mirrors. Culture became statecraft. Augustus did not only command armies, he curated memory. He wanted Romans to believe that the age of chaos had ended because the old virtues had been revived. Marriage laws, moral reforms, religious renewal, and public imagery all worked to present his regime as a return to seriousness after corruption. Yet beneath the piety was control. The household, the gods, the army, the provinces, the calendar, and even memory itself were drawn into the orbit of the princeps. The empire now possessed a center that could endure beyond annual office. Or so Augustus hoped. Succession became the hidden wound of the new order. The Republic had no legal mechanism for hereditary monarchy because it refused to admit monarchy existed. Augustus had to create heirs without saying he was founding a dynasty. Sons-in-law, adopted sons, grandsons, nephews, and trusted relatives moved through a dangerous choreography of expectation. Death stalked the household. Promising heirs vanished into illness, accident, or political darkness. Finally, Tiberius emerged as the successor, not beloved perhaps, but positioned. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. Behind the polished marble and official inscriptions lay whispered fears, family tensions, exiles, ambitions, and the quiet terror of being close to power. The palace was not merely a residence, it was a weather system. A glance could change a career. A marriage could alter the succession. A death could disturb the empire. Augustus gave Rome what it had lacked for generations: stability. But the price was the old liberty of the ruling class, the dangerous freedom of political competition, the possibility that no one man stood above the state. Many welcomed the exchange. Peace is persuasive when memory is full of graves. Rome did not stop being violent under Augustus. Its violence became more organized. It pushed to frontiers, counted provinces, taxed fields, stationed legions, rewarded colonies, mapped roads, and made the Mediterranean feel like an inner sea of Roman order. The Republic had conquered an empire chaotically. Augustus taught that empire to speak with one voice, and so Rome entered its most astonishing illusion. That one man could rule everything, while insisting that nothing essential had changed. A Roman road does not whisper. It speaks in straight lines, across hills, marshes, forests, valleys, deserts, and mountain passes. It announces an intention almost frightening in its clarity. Distance will be measured. Terrain will be disciplined. Soldiers will move. Messages will arrive. Taxes will flow. Governors will command. Merchants will follow. And those who live beside the stones will learn, day by day, that the empire is not an idea floating somewhere beyond the horizon. It is beneath their feet. The Roman world was held together not only by armies, but by surfaces: stone roads, paved forums, harbor quays, aqueduct channels, amphitheater seating, bathhouse floors, milestones, bridges, drains, warehouses, walls, door thresholds worn smooth by generations of passing bodies. Rome made power visible through construction, and then made construction feel like civilization itself. To walk into a Roman city was to enter a landscape of order. Not perfect order, never that. Every city had noise, stink, crowding, poverty, flies, smoke, stray animals, and the sharp human tensions of status and survival. But the architecture of Roman rule had a pattern, a grammar repeated across provinces in local variations. Streets intersected. Public squares gathered political and commercial life. Temples honored gods, emperors, and civic benefactors. Baths promised warmth, cleansing, gossip, exercise, and display. The amphitheater offered blood under discipline. The theater offered language, masks, laughter, and myth. The basilica framed law and business beneath high roofs. The city became a lesson in belonging. Rome did not need every inhabitant of the empire to live like a Roman senator. It needed enough people to recognize Roman order as desirable, useful, profitable, and difficult to escape. Material culture carried this lesson in objects as much as monuments. Pottery moved through trade networks in astonishing quantities. Amphorae carried wine, oil, fish sauce, and grain across sea lanes and river routes. terra sigillata, that glossy red tableware found across vast regions, placed a kind of shared visual language onto dining tables far from Italy. Coins bore imperial faces into the hands of soldiers, merchants, farmers, prostitutes, tax collectors, priests, and slaves. Inscriptions turned stone into public memory, naming donors, offices, repairs, dedications, emperors, gods, units, freedmen, and local elites eager to be seen in the language of power. Archaeology often finds empire in fragments: a stamped tile from a military workshop, a child's shoe preserved in damp soil, a broken oil lamp, a curse tablet folded and buried, a stylus from a writing tablet, a gaming counter, a butchered animal bone, a lead pipe with an inscription, a drain choked with seeds and refuse. These small finds are not decorative footnotes to history. They are history. They show how rule entered daily life, how grand power became habit, how people touched the empire while eating, bathing, writing, praying, buying, cheating, and dying. Concrete was one of Rome's quiet miracles, with lime, aggregate or volcanic ash, and practical experimentation. Roman builders created structures of extraordinary durability. Concrete allowed vaults, domes, massive foundations, harbor installations, bath complexes, and ambitious forms that would have been difficult or impossible using older methods alone. It gave Roman architecture a new physical imagination. Space could be enclosed at grand scale. Water could be channeled. Hillsides could be reshaped. Imperial ambition could harden into walls that defied centuries. The aqueduct became one of the empire's most powerful symbols. From distant springs, water traveled along gradients so carefully measured that the mind almost pauses before the patience required. Channels cut through hills, arches strode across valleys. Settling tanks slowed sediment, pipes fed fountains, baths, houses, latrines, gardens, and workshops. Water did more than relieve thirst. It advertised competence. It told the city that Roman order could make nature serve public life. Yet water was never simply generous. It was controlled. Who received it? Who paid for it? Who stole it? Who repaired it? And who displayed it mattered. A fountain in a public square could present the empire as benefactor, while elite houses enjoyed private access that signaled rank. The aqueduct was both gift and hierarchy, both utility and theater. Bathhouses revealed the same complexity. To the modern imagination, the Roman bath can seem luxurious, almost gentle, with warm rooms, cold pools, steam, oil, scraping tools, conversation, and leisure. But the bath was also a social institution, a place where bodies entered a shared architectural rhythm. Rich and poor might use the same complex at different times or in different ways, but status did not vanish in the steam. Clothing, attendance, oils, jewelry, scars, speech, and confidence all spoke. The bath made the empire intimate. It brought Roman habits to the skin. The amphitheater brought them to the nerves. There, violence became public order. Gladiators, condemned criminals, wild animals, staged hunts, executions, and spectacles of discipline unfolded before carefully arranged crowds. Seating reflected status. The emperor or local magistrate appeared as giver of games. The crowd roared, judged, demanded, and participated in ritualized power. Blood was not chaos when contained in the arena. It was hierarchy performed. It told the audience that life and death could be organized, displayed, and made meaningful under Roman authority. The arena was not separate from civilization. For Rome, it was part of civilization. Cities competed in generosity. Local elites funded buildings, games, baths, repairs, banquets, and temples. Their names were carved in stone. This was not merely vanity. It was the mechanism of urban empire. Rome did not have to build everything from the center. It encouraged local ambition to build Rome everywhere. A wealthy provincial who paid for a theater was not only decorating his town, he was proving that his community belonged within the imperial order and that he himself deserved honor inside it. This system was flexible in Gaul, North Africa, Britain, Spain, Syria, Greece, and the Balkans. Roman urban forms mingled with older traditions. Local gods received Roman-style temples. Native elites adopted Latin names while preserving regional loyalties. Markets grew near forts. Military camps became towns. Veterans settled in colonies and carried habits of army life into civilian landscapes. The empire did not erase difference all at once. It arranged difference beneath recognizable forms. Language was another road. Latin spread through army, administration, law, colonization, and ambition, especially in the western provinces. Greek remained powerful in the east, where older urban cultures and literary traditions were too deep to be replaced. The empire was not linguistically simple. It functioned through translation, bilingual elites, local speech, official formulas, and practical compromise. A person could be culturally Roman in one setting, locally rooted in another, and spiritually tied to traditions older than the empire itself. Law gave Roman power a different kind of permanence. To be Roman was increasingly to live within a world of legal categories: citizen, non-citizen, freed person, slave, soldier, magistrate, taxpayer, debtor, heir, wife, patron, client. Law could protect, exclude, define, and dominate. It gave empire a language of procedure: a tax demand, a military discharge, a property transfer, a manumission, a court appeal, a citizenship grant. These acts created paper worlds, tablet worlds, inscription worlds, where identity could be recorded and contested. The spread of citizenship slowly altered the empire's inner logic. At first, citizenship was a guarded privilege. Over time, grants to communities, soldiers, elites, and eventually broader populations changed what Roman belonging meant. Citizenship could reward loyalty, encourage service, elevate local leaders, and bind provincial ambition to imperial structures. It was one of Rome's most potent instruments, not because it made everyone equal, but because it made inequality negotiable within a Roman frame. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. The stones preserve donors better than laborers. Inscriptions name magistrates more often than quarry workers. Aqueducts impress us with geometry, but not always with the bodies that cut, hauled, burned lime, lifted blocks, and died beneath collapsed scaffolding. The glittering city rested on labor visible and invisible, free and enslaved, skilled and coerced. Roman order had a cost measured in backs, hands, lungs, and graves. A road could bring trade. It could also bring an army. A bath could bring pleasure. It could also display rank. A city wall could protect. It could also remind the inhabitants that fear lived nearby. Rome's built world was therefore never innocent. It was beautiful, practical, violent, generous, exploitative, enduring, and seductive all at once. That is why it worked. People do not submit for centuries to terror alone. They submit, cooperate, adapt, and participate when power gives them roads to profit, courts to use, titles to seek, spectacles to enjoy, water to drink, and identities that feel larger than the village horizon. The empire became stone, water, law, and habit. It stood in the morning shadow of aqueduct arches. It steamed from bathhouse roofs. It clattered in carts over paving slabs. It gleamed on coins passed hand to hand in frontier markets. It waited in the straight road beyond the city gate, running onward with Roman certainty into lands where gods and mortals still argued beneath different skies. Only time will tell what future excavations will reveal from drains, dumps, workshops, barracks, cemeteries, and drowned harbors. But the material world already tells us something profound. Rome ruled because it made itself useful. Rome endured because it made itself visible. Rome felt eternal because everywhere one looked, it had taught stone to remember. The Roman world was crowded with gods. They stood at crossroads, watched from household shrines, guarded fields, haunted springs, received smoke from altars, listened in temples, marched with armies, traveled in ships, and entered dreams. To live beneath Rome was not to inhabit a silent universe of dead matter. The world was alive with presence. Thunder had meaning. Birds in flight had meaning. A strange birth, a cracked statue, a lightning strike, a failed harvest, a disease in the cattle, a voice heard in the dark, all might be signs in a language older than law. Roman religion was not founded on private belief in the modern sense. It was founded on relationship. The gods were honored so that the community might endure. Ritual had to be performed correctly. Words mattered, gestures mattered, dates mattered. The health of the state depended on maintaining peace with divine powers. A sacrifice badly made could be repeated. An omen poorly handled could endanger armies. Priests did not merely comfort souls. They helped manage the fragile boundary between human order and cosmic danger. At the center of Roman life stood the household. Before the empire was a frontier, before the Senate was a chamber of old men, before the army was a machine of iron and road dust, religion began beside the domestic fire. The household gods, the spirits of storage, ancestors, thresholds, and family continuity made the home into a sacred landscape. A small shrine in a corner could hold more emotional power than a marble temple on a hill. There, offerings were made. There, family memory gathered. There, a child learned that the invisible world was not distant, but close enough to stand beside the meal. Public religion expanded this intimacy into civic form. The city had gods who protected its walls, its people, its harvests, its armies, its treaties, and its future. Festivals filled the calendar with rhythm. Processions moved through streets. Priests in ancient clothing repeated formulas whose age gave them authority. Virgins tended sacred fire. Augurs watched the sky. Haruspices examined the bodies of sacrificed animals, seeking divine messages in the liver and entrails. To modern eyes, such practices may seem strange, but to the Romans they were instruments of caution. The gods were powerful, and power must be consulted. Empire made the sacred world larger. As Rome absorbed cities, kingdoms, tribes, and provinces, it encountered gods with unfamiliar names and familiar functions. Some were translated into Roman terms. A local warrior god might be understood through Mars, a mother goddess through Juno or Ceres, a sky god through Jupiter. This did not always erase local identity. Instead, divine worlds overlapped, blended, and multiplied. A person might honor a Roman deity in public, a local deity at a regional shrine, a household spirit at home, and a mystery god in private devotion. Rome usually tolerated abundance. Its religious instinct was inclusion, provided worship did not threaten public order or reject the sacred framework of the state. Foreign gods could be invited, adopted, regulated, or honored. In times of crisis, Rome sometimes looked beyond its own traditions for divine assistance. Sacred stones, new rites, Eastern goddesses, healing gods, and mystery cults found their way into Roman life. The empire became a marketplace of salvation, fear, gratitude, and hope. Among soldiers, religion had its own hard edge. The army carried standards that were not merely military signs but sacred objects. Camps had altars. Oaths bound men not only to commanders but to divine witness. Victories required thanks. Defeats required explanation. On distant frontiers, soldiers raised dedications to Jupiter, Mars, local gods, river gods, desert gods, and divine abstractions such as victory, fortune, discipline, and the spirit of the emperor. In remote forts, beneath cold skies or desert heat, a carved altar could make the empire feel watched over. The emperor himself became part of this sacred system. The imperial cult was one of Rome's most subtle tools. It did not always claim that a living emperor was a god in the same manner everywhere. Practice varied by region and period. But worship of the emperor's spirit, genius, divine household, or deified predecessors created a ritual language of loyalty. To sacrifice for the emperor was to acknowledge the order he embodied. In the provinces, temples to Rome and Augustus allowed local elites to display loyalty, gain prestige, and participate in imperial identity. This was politics through incense. A statue of the emperor in a provincial city was not just art, it was presence. A festival in his honor was not just devotion, it was allegiance. The divine emperor connected town squares, army camps, provincial councils, and distant communities to the center of power. In a world without modern communications, ritual made empire visible and emotionally charged. But no sacred order is without restlessness. Beneath the public ceremonies moved private longings. People feared death. They feared illness, infertility, betrayal, debt, bad luck, angry spirits, and the uncertainty of the grave. Official religion protected the community, but individuals wanted healing, meaning purification, forgiveness, and personal hope. Mystery cults offered initiation into deeper sacred stories. Isis promised care that crossed seas and borders. Mithras attracted many soldiers and men through secretive rites of struggle, loyalty, and cosmic order. Cybele, Serapis, Sabazius, and countless local powers drew worshippers seeking something more intimate than civic sacrifice. Magic and religion were not easily separated. Curse tablets buried in graves, wells, sanctuaries, and arenas show a world where ordinary people tried to bend hidden forces toward personal ends. They asked for rivals to be silenced, thieves exposed, lovers compelled, horses slowed, lawsuits won, and enemies weakened. Folded lead tablets speak in voices often absent from official histories. They reveal anger, fear, desperation, and belief that words placed in the right location might move unseen powers. Then came Christianity. At first, it was small, strange, and easily dismissed by many members of the Roman elite. It emerged from the Jewish world of the Eastern Mediterranean, carrying claims about a crucified and risen Savior, the coming judgment, the kingdom of God, repentance, baptism, communal care, and a loyalty that refused to treat the gods of the empire as true gods. This refusal mattered. Rome could tolerate many gods, but Christianity did not want to stand as one cult among many. It denied the sacred reality of the others. That made it dangerous, not because early Christians possessed armies. They did not. Not because they threatened Rome in the ordinary political sense. For the most part, they were small communities of artisans, slaves, freed people, women, merchants, teachers, and local leaders. But their refusal to sacrifice to the traditional gods and the emperor's cult looked like stubborn impiety. If disaster struck, who was to blame? If plague came? If famine spread? If the frontier trembled? Might not the gods be angry because some people had rejected them? Persecution was uneven. It depended on emperors, governors, local tensions, and moments of crisis. Some Christians died in arenas, prisons, and execution grounds. Some recanted, some hid. Some wrote defenses of their faith. Martyr stories circulated, turning defeat into witness and death into victory. The empire understood punishment as spectacle. Christians learned to transform spectacle into testimony. Slowly, stubbornly, the new faith grew. It offered belonging across class and ethnicity. It cared for the poor, at least in ideal and often in practice. It gave cosmic meaning to suffering. It honored women in some communal roles while also developing its own hierarchies. It promised resurrection, moral order, and a God not confined to one city, mountain, river, or people. In the crowded spiritual world of Rome, Christianity was both one movement among many and something radically different. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. We cannot hear most prayers spoken in alleys, kitchens, barracks, cemeteries, or beside sickbeds. We have inscriptions, catacomb paintings, hostile accusations, theological writings, amulets, altars, temple ruins, and the scars of later transformation. But the inner weather of belief is difficult to excavate. Archaeology can reveal a shrine, but not always the trembling hand that lit the lamp. The gods of Rome did not vanish in a single night. Old rites persisted, local devotions endured. Philosophers debated the divine, emperors sought favor. Christians argued with pagans, Jews, heretics, and one another. The spiritual empire was not cleanly conquered. It was contested, layered, haunted. In the end, Rome's sacred world reveals one of its deepest truths. Power needs more than soldiers. It needs meaning. It needs rituals that make hierarchy feel natural, festivals that make memory shared, gods that bless the harvest, altars that bless the army, and stories that tell ordinary people where they stand beneath the stars. For centuries, Rome ruled bodies with law and sword, but it ruled imaginations with fire, incense, sacrifice, fear, and hope. At the edges of the Roman world, the map became uncertain. There were lines, yes, walls, rivers, roads, forts, watchtowers, ditches, palisades, desert roads, signal stations, and military zones marked by the dull patience of administration. But no frontier was ever simply a line. It was a wound, a marketplace, a meeting place, a threat, a promise, and a question. Rome liked to imagine order, Beyond order lay peoples who did not always accept Roman categories: Germans beyond the Rhine, Dacians beyond the Danube, Parthians and later Persians in the east, tribes, kingdoms, confederations, nomads, farmers, traders, raiders, diplomats, deserters, captives, interpreters, and border families who belonged partly to both worlds and fully to neither. The frontier was where Rome discovered that conquest had limits, and that limits required constant labor. A frontier fort was not a marble fantasy. It was mud, timber, stone, leather, smoke, iron, sweat, orders, boredom, disease, gambling, letters home, and the endless maintenance of military life. A soldier stationed far from Italy might wake beneath a cold northern sky or a blazing desert sun, surrounded by men from many provinces, speaking Latin in accents shaped by distant childhoods. The empire gathered its subjects, armed them, trained them, and sent them to guard boundaries most would never have imagined as children. In Britain, at the northern edge of imperial reach, Hadrian's Wall stretched across the landscape with a severe and almost dream-like confidence. It did not mark the end of human life, as though civilization stopped and emptiness began. Communities lived beyond it. Trade crossed it. Messages crossed it. Violence crossed it. The wall was not a barrier against nothingness. It was a controlled membrane between political worlds. Its stones, mile castles, forts, ditches, gates, and roads reveal an empire obsessed with movement and permission. Who may pass? Who must wait? Who pays? Who is watched? Who is counted? Archaeology at sites along the wall has uncovered tablets, shoes, tools, weapons, altars, animal bones, and refuse. These are humble things, but they are more intimate than imperial speeches. A wooden writing tablet can bring us closer to the heartbeat of the frontier than a triumphal monument. At Vindolanda, letters preserved in waterlogged soil speak of birthday invitations, supply requests, complaints, military reports, and ordinary anxieties. The people of the frontier were not shadows. They asked for socks, cloaks, beer, leave, justice, and news. Their world was cold and human. While emperors posed as guardians of cosmic order, someone near the wall was worrying about transport animals, damp clothing, missing supplies, and whether a friend would attend a household celebration. This is the wonder of frontier archaeology. It breaks the spell of abstraction. The Rhine and Danube formed some of Rome's most important boundaries, not because rivers are magical lines, but because they could organize defense, movement, and supply. Along them rose legionary bases, auxiliary forts, watchposts, harbors, workshops, civilian settlements, and roads. The frontier was an ecosystem. Soldiers needed food, boots, weapons, pottery, animals, timber, women, merchants, priests, doctors, smiths, and entertainers. Around camps grew communities, some temporary, some permanent, some destined to become towns. The army was not only a fighting force, it was a builder of worlds. Where the legion settled, forests were cut, roads laid, clay fired, stone quarried, fields supplied, and local economies transformed. Military demand reshaped landscapes. A fort needed grain. A cavalry unit needed fodder. A bathhouse needed fuel. A road needed repair. The frontier consumed. It also paid. Traders followed soldiers because soldiers had wages. Local elites cooperated because the imperial army could bring opportunity as well as coercion. But the edge of empire was never still. Diplomacy mattered as much as battle. Rome made treaties with neighboring peoples, paid subsidies, accepted hostages, recognized friendly kings, recruited warriors, interfered in succession disputes, and tried to keep potential enemies divided. The frontier was managed through gifts and intimidation, raids and negotiations, marriages and betrayals. Rome did not simply stand behind walls waiting. It reached beyond them constantly. Sometimes it struck deep. Trajan's wars in Dacia show Rome at its most aggressive, the kingdom north of the Danube, rich in resources and strategically troubling, became the target of full imperial conquest. The reliefs of Trajan's column present the campaign as ordered victory, a stone scroll of soldiers, bridges, forts, sacrifices, speeches, marches, and submission. Yet behind the carved narrative lay burned settlements, dead warriors, enslaved captives, seized treasure, and a landscape reorganized under Roman rule. The column is art. It is also propaganda. It teaches viewers how empire wished to remember violence. In the East, the frontier was different again. There Rome faced not scattered tribes, but great imperial rivals, Parthia, and later the Sasanian Persian Empire, possessed cavalry traditions, royal ideology, cities, wealth, diplomacy, and strategic depth. The Euphrates did not separate order from chaos. It separated competing civilizations with their own visions of sacred kingship and world rule. Eastern wars could bring glory or disaster. Crassus found disaster at Carrhae, where Roman confidence bled into the dust beneath Parthian arrows. Later emperors sought revenge, prestige, and control. But the East resisted simple conquest. Cities changed hands. Client kingdoms shifted. Armenia became a chessboard of imperial rivalry. Desert roads carried merchants, spies, pilgrims, tax officials, and armies. In these lands, Rome was not the only empire that believed heaven favored its rule. The frontier also entered Roman imagination. It gave emperors a stage. A ruler could appear among soldiers, address the army, inspect defenses, distribute donatives, receive embassies, and claim that vigilance preserved civilization. Emperors who neglected the army risked contempt. Emperors who pleased it gained breathing space. The frontier legions watched the throne from afar, but not passively. In time, they would make and unmake emperors. Military life was sacred as well as practical. Altars from frontier forts show dedications to Jupiter, Mars, Mithras, local gods, river spirits, the emperor's spirit, and divine abstractions such as victory or discipline. A soldier on the edge of the known world needed protection from more than enemy blades. He needed the gods to watch the road, the night, the river crossing, the fever, the wound, and the long ache of absence from home. Still, the frontier created identities that were neither purely Roman nor purely local. Auxiliary soldiers recruited from provinces might serve far from their birthplace, gain citizenship after long service, settle in new lands, and raise children shaped by camp culture. Veterans carried Roman military habits into civilian life. Local women married soldiers or formed households near forts. Children grew up hearing multiple languages, seeing mixed rituals, and living beneath the shadow of standards. The empire did not merely defend frontiers, it produced frontier peoples. Yet beneath all this movement lay strain. Every mile of defended boundary required money. Every fort required supply. Every soldier required pay. Every road required maintenance. Every diplomatic payment implied future expectation. Expansion brought wealth, but holding territory brought cost. The farther Rome stretched, the more it depended on administrative competence, tax extraction, military loyalty, and stable succession. The frontiers were Rome's pride. They were also Rome's burden. Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made from buried forts, river crossings, desert stations, and forgotten cemeteries. Still, the evidence already murmurs its warning. An empire may look strongest at its edges, with walls rising and standards flying, yet those same edges reveal the truth of its condition. Rome had taken the world into its arms, but the world was heavy. The 3rd century came upon Rome like a fever that would not break. For generations, the empire had survived bad emperors, frontier wars, court murders, mutinies, fires, scandals, succession crises, and outbreaks of disease. It had endured because the great frame still held. Taxes moved, armies obeyed, cities functioned, roads carried officials and grain, provinces yielded revenue. The emperor, whoever he happened to be, stood at the summit of a system vast enough to outlive individual incompetence. But there are ages when strain gathers from every direction at once. In the 3rd century, Rome faced not one disaster, but a convergence. Plague, inflation, civil war, frontier pressure, political assassination, economic disruption, rural insecurity, religious anxiety, military overextension. The empire did not collapse in a single moment, but it began to convulse, as though the machinery of rule had become too heavy for the hands that tried to steer it. The imperial throne became deadly in a new way. Emperors rose through army favor and fell through army anger. Some ruled for years, others for months. Some only long enough to issue coins, make promises, and be murdered. The old imperial dignity became unstable, almost haunted. Purple cloth no longer meant security. It meant exposure. A commander acclaimed by his troops on the frontier could become emperor because soldiers needed pay, prestige, and victory. Another army, loyal to another commander, could reject him. The empire became a battlefield of legitimacy. The Senate still existed, but the age of senatorial confidence was fading. Power belonged increasingly to men of the camps, hard soldiers shaped by frontier crisis rather than old aristocratic ceremony. These soldier emperors were not all fools or tyrants. Some were capable, energetic, and brave. They rode toward danger because danger was everywhere. But even capable men found themselves trapped inside a brutal rhythm, a threat on the Rhine, a rebellion in the east, a usurper in the Balkans, a plague in the cities, a treasury short of silver, an army demanding donatives, a frontier people testing Roman weakness. To rule was to race from wound to wound with a bandage in one hand and a sword in the other. Coins reveal the sickness. Numismatic study shows a gradual debasement of silver currency across the crisis, as emperors stretched precious metal, thinner and thinner to meet military and administrative needs. A coin that once carried reliable value became a sign of desperation. The imperial image remained stamped upon it: radiate crown, stern profile, divine titles, promises of victory and abundance. Yet the metal itself told a different story. The emperor proclaimed eternity, while the coin betrayed anxiety. Inflation gnawed at trust. Prices rose, payments lost meaning. Soldiers demanded more, officials squeezed harder. Taxation became more oppressive, not always because rulers were uniquely cruel, but because the system required resources it could no longer easily obtain. The empire needed armies to defend revenue, and revenue to pay armies. When either side faltered, the circle tightened. Plague darkened the century. The so-called Antonine Plague had already struck in the late 2nd century, carried through the interconnected world of soldiers, merchants, and cities. Later, the plague of Cyprian ravaged communities during the 3rd century, described by Christian and non-Christian voices as a catastrophe of bodies, fear, and social strain. Modern scholars debate the exact pathogens behind these outbreaks. Ancient descriptions are not laboratory reports. Still, the demographic and psychological effects of epidemic disease were severe. Fields lose laborers, armies lose recruits, cities lose artisans, families lose children. Temples fill with desperate offerings, graves multiply. Disease is not only biological, it is political. When people die in numbers too large to explain, confidence trembles. The gods are questioned, the emperor is judged, foreigners are blamed, minorities become vulnerable, prophets are heard more eagerly, old rituals may be intensified, and new faiths may grow because they offer meaning amid terror. The crisis of the 3rd century was not merely a military crisis, it was a crisis of explanation. Climate and environment also pressed upon the human world. Paleoclimate studies, tree rings, ice cores, pollen records, and other proxies suggest that shifts in climate patterns affected harvests, disease environments, and movement across Eurasia in complex ways. No honest historian should reduce Rome's difficulties to weather alone, yet drought, cooling, unstable rainfall, and crop failure can sharpen every political blade. A hungry frontier is a dangerous frontier. A bad harvest makes taxation feel like theft. A weakened population is more vulnerable to epidemic. Environmental stress does not command armies by itself, but it can push people toward migration, raiding, revolt, and desperation. On the frontiers, Rome's enemies were changing. Beyond the Rhine and Danube, larger confederations such as the Goths, Franks, and Alemanni began to appear in Roman sources. These were not simple tribes frozen outside history. They were dynamic political formations, shaped partly by contact with Rome itself. Trade, war, diplomacy, subsidies, recruitment, and pressure from other peoples all contributed to new identities and larger war bands. Rome had spent centuries influencing the world beyond its borders. Now that world had learned from Rome, profited from Rome, and watched for Roman weakness. In the East, the rise of the Sasanian Persian Empire brought a more aggressive and ideologically potent rival than the old Parthian order. Persian kings claimed universal authority and challenged Rome for control of Armenia, Mesopotamia, and the prestige of world empire. The capture of Emperor Valerian by Shapur I was one of the most shocking humiliations in Roman history. An emperor of Rome, living symbol of imperial majesty, taken alive by an Eastern king. The image was almost unbearable. The empire fractured. For a time, separate imperial regimes emerged in the West and East, not always because people wanted Rome to die, but because local defense required immediate authority. The Gallic Empire in the West and the Palmyrene power in the East show how regional structures could detach when the center faltered. These breakaway realms still used Roman language, Roman titles, Roman administrative habits, and Roman claims. That is the strange truth. Even rebellion often spoke Roman. Aurelian, One of the hardest and most formidable soldier emperors pulled the empire back together. He defeated Palmyra. He recovered the West. He strengthened defenses and surrounded Rome itself with new walls. The building of walls around the capital was symbolically immense. The city that had once seemed the mistress of an obedient world now admitted, in brick and mortar, that danger could reach its heart. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. Coin hoards buried in fear and never recovered tell us of people who expected to return and did not. Burn layers in towns reveal sudden violence or abandonment, but not always the names of attackers. Mass graves suggest disease or massacre, but rarely preserve the final words of the dead. Fort repairs show urgency. Rural settlement changes hint at insecurity. Inscriptions grow fewer in some regions, as though public confidence itself had become quieter. And yet Rome survived, wounded, altered, militarized, poorer in some places, more coercive in others, but alive. Survival came at a price. The empire that emerged from crisis was not the easy urban empire of old civic pride and expanding prosperity. It was harsher, more centralized, more anxious, more openly dependent on compulsion. The state reached deeper into lives because it feared losing them. Farmers, soldiers, officials, craftsmen, taxpayers, and city councils all felt the grip tighten. The 3rd century did not end Rome. It changed what Rome had to become in order not to die. The fever passed, but the patient did not rise unchanged. Diocletian looked upon the wounded empire and understood that survival required a new shape. The old world of a single emperor, moving with impossible speed from frontier to frontier, had become unworkable. The empire was too large, too threatened, too administratively complex, and too vulnerable to sudden assassination. One ruler could not be everywhere. One court could not hear everything. One army could not answer every fire on every horizon. Rome had endured, but endurance alone was no longer enough. So Diocletian did what Romans often did in moments of terror. He reorganized. He divided authority without admitting weakness. He multiplied emperors without abandoning unity. He created the tetrarchy, a rule of 4, with senior emperors and junior emperors stationed nearer the regions they were meant to defend. This was not a sentimental system. It was military mathematics. If danger rose on the Rhine, an emperor could be there. If Persia threatened the east, an emperor could answer. If rebellion stirred in Egypt, if raiders crossed the Danube, if usurpers gathered soldiers, the imperial presence would not be a distant rumor. It would have armor, court officials, tax records, and marching orders. The emperor became less a citizen among citizens and more a sacred figure raised above ordinary humanity. Ceremony thickened around him, access narrowed, court ritual grew more elaborate. Kneeling, titles, robes, guards, curtains, and controlled appearances turned imperial power into theater of distance. This was not vanity alone. It was protection. A ruler surrounded by awe is harder to treat as merely another ambitious general. In a century of murdered emperors, majesty became a shield. Yet majesty needed money. Diocletian's reforms reached into taxation, administration, coinage, prices, military command, and provincial government. Provinces were divided into smaller units, making them easier to supervise and harder for governors to convert into personal kingdoms. Civil and military authority were increasingly separated. reducing the danger that one official could command both revenue and troops with too much independence. Bureaucracy expanded because the state demanded knowledge. Who owned what? Who produced what? Who owed what? Who could be moved, counted, taxed, and compelled? The empire was becoming a machine of survival. For those caught beneath it, survival could feel like pressure. The tax burden hardened. Local city councils, once proud centers of civic life, increasingly became instruments for collecting imperial demands. The old culture of voluntary benefaction, where elites funded buildings and festivals to win honor, faded in many places beneath heavier obligations. A rich man might once have competed to decorate his city. Now he might fear being trapped in responsibility for its taxes. Honor became duty. Duty became burden. Burden became flight, evasion, or resentment. Diocletian tried to command the economy itself. His famous edict on maximum prices attempted to restrain inflation by fixing costs for goods, services, and wages across the empire. The ambition was immense, almost desperate in its confidence that imperial authority could force stability upon markets, shortages, greed, and fear. The inscriptions that preserve parts of this edict are monuments not only to regulation, but to anxiety. The state saw disorder in prices and answered with law carved in stone. But stone cannot easily command hunger. It cannot make harvests abundant, merchants honest, transport cheap, or soldiers patient. The edict reveals the reach of imperial will, but also the limits of that will. Rome could threaten, classify, punish, and prescribe. It could not always heal the conditions that made prices rise. Then came Constantine, a man of war, vision, calculation, and religious consequence. He emerged from the violent aftermath of the Tetrarchy, when the carefully designed system of shared rule gave way to rivalry. Sons, generals, claimants, and armies competed. The dream of orderly succession fractured under the old pressures of ambition and blood. Constantine fought his way through the storm. At the Milvian Bridge, outside Rome, he defeated Maxentius and entered history not only as victor, but as the emperor whose name would become inseparable from Christianity. The story of Constantine's vision, the sign in the sky, the divine promise of victory, belongs to the borderland between faith, propaganda, memory, and political transformation. Whatever private experience lay behind it, the public result was profound. Christianity, once persecuted, gained imperial favor. The Edict of Milan granted toleration. Bishops entered imperial circles. Church disputes became matters of imperial concern. The cross, once associated with shameful execution, began its rise toward the center of Roman power. This did not make the empire instantly Christian. Old gods did not vanish at a command. Pagan senators, traditional cults, rural shrines, philosophical schools, local rituals, and inherited devotions remained alive. Constantine himself moved within a world where religious identities could be complex, strategic, sincere, and evolving. But the direction of history had shifted. The imperial state had begun to favor a faith that earlier emperors had sometimes feared as subversive. A new sacred language entered government. The emperor could be imagined not merely as favored by the gods, but as chosen by the one God. Church councils could be summoned under imperial authority. Bishops could petition emperors. Theology could disturb politics. Disputes over the nature of Christ, Unity, doctrine, heresy, and authority were no longer only internal religious quarrels. They became imperial matters because the peace of the Church was increasingly tied to the peace of the empire. Constantine also founded a new capital on the site of ancient Byzantium, commanding the waters between Europe and Asia. He created Constantinople. Its location was brilliant. It faced the wealthier and more strategically vital eastern Mediterranean. It looked toward the Danube, the Black Sea, Asia Minor, Syria, and the roots of imperial survival. Rome remained sacred, immense in memory, and symbolically unmatched. But power was moving. The empire no longer needed to imagine its center only beside the Tiber. Constantinople was not merely a city, it was a declaration. The Roman Empire could renew itself somewhere else. It could carry Roman law, ceremony, administration, architecture, and ambition into a new urban body. It could remain Roman without being ruled from Rome. This was one of the great transformations in world history. The name Rome became both a place and a political inheritance, capable of migration. The empire that Diocletian and Constantine shaped was stronger in some ways and more constrained in others. It defended itself with deeper bureaucracy, more rigid taxation, greater military organization, and sacred monarchy. It also demanded more from its people. Farmers were tied more closely to land. Professions could become hereditary. The state wanted predictability, because unpredictability had almost killed it. Freedom narrowed where fiscal necessity widened. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. We do not know how an ordinary villager felt when tax assessors arrived with new records. We do not know the private prayers of a pagan artisan watching imperial favor turn toward the church. We do not know the thoughts of a bishop standing in a palace, realizing that the persecuted faith now spoke in rooms of power. We do not know the fear of a city councilor responsible for payments his community could barely make. The 4th century was not a simple rebirth. It was a bargain. Rome survived by becoming heavier, holier, more bureaucratic, more divided in function, and more open about the sacred distance between ruler and ruled. The loose civic empire of cities and senators gave way to an empire of courts, commands, bishops, tax schedules, frontier armies, and imperial capitals. Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made from law codes, papyri, church foundations, abandoned villas, military cemeteries, and the deep stratigraphy of late antique cities. But the outline already stands before us. Rome did not escape crisis by returning to what it had been. Rome escaped by becoming something stranger. The Western Empire did not fall in the way a statue falls. It did not topple in one clean, thunderous instant, striking the earth while all who watched understood that an age had ended. It came apart unevenly, region by region, province by province, household by household, in tax records not collected, roads not repaired, soldiers not paid, towns no longer defended, estates fortified, loyalties transferred, and local people learning the old government would not always arrive. Collapse is often imagined as a dramatic scene, a city burning, a gate broken, a barbarian king standing among fallen columns, an emperor stripped of purple. But for many who lived through the 5th century, the end may have felt less like apocalypse and more like confusion. One year, taxes were demanded in the name of the emperor. Another year, they were demanded by a general, a king, a local magnate, or an army needing supplies. Coins changed, officials changed, laws were still copied, Latin still spoken, bishops still preached, markets still opened, children still cried from hunger or boredom, fields still needed plowing. The empire faded into new arrangements before everyone agreed it was gone. Pressure on the frontiers had intensified for generations. The peoples beyond Rome's borders were not faceless destroyers waiting in darkness. They were communities with their own histories, leaders, rivalries, fears, and ambitions. Many had traded with Rome. Many had served in Roman armies. Many desired land, security, status, and access to imperial wealth. Rome had shaped them as surely as they threatened Rome. The frontier was not a wall between civilization and chaos. It was a long zone of contact where identities hardened, shifted, and adapted. The arrival of the Huns transformed the world beyond the Danube. Mounted power from the steppe drove fear across existing political landscapes, pushing Gothic groups toward the empire's borders. In 376, Goths crossed into Roman territory, seeking refuge. This moment has often been treated as an invasion, but it began also as a migration under desperate conditions. They asked to enter. Rome allowed them, but the management of their settlement became a catastrophe of exploitation, corruption, hunger, and humiliation. Officials abused them. Food was withheld or sold at cruel prices. People who had sought safety were treated as prey. The result was rebellion. At Adrianople in 378, a Roman army led by Emperor Valens met the Goths and was destroyed. Valens died. The defeat shocked the empire. A Roman emperor had fallen in battle against a people who had recently entered Roman territory as refugees and dependents. Adrianople did not end the empire, but it exposed a new reality. Large armed groups inside imperial boundaries could no longer always be dissolved, scattered, or absorbed on Roman terms. The Western state became increasingly dependent on barbarian soldiers and commanders. Though the word barbarian hides more than it reveals, these men could be deeply entangled with Roman life. They sought Roman titles, Roman pay, Roman legitimacy, and Roman recognition. Some fought for the empire loyally. Some fought against it when betrayed, excluded, or ambitious. The army that defended Rome was no longer simply Roman in the old civic sense, yet the empire had depended on provincial and non-Italian manpower for centuries. What changed was not diversity itself, but the weakening capacity of the state to control military power. The sack of Rome in 410 by the Goths under Alaric struck the imagination of the ancient world like a dark bell. Rome had not been the practical center of imperial power for some time, but it remained the sacred city of memory. To see it entered by enemy forces was to witness a symbolic violation. Pagans blamed Christians for abandoning the old gods. Christians answered that earthly cities were mortal and that only the heavenly city endured. Refugees carried stories of terror, loss, and desecration. Yet Rome was not erased. It continued, wounded, diminished, but alive. Still, something had changed. The old aura of inviolability had cracked. Across the West, imperial authority thinned. Britain slipped from effective Roman control. Local leaders faced raiders and internal disorder with little help from the distant state. In Gaul, competing powers carved influence among Roman aristocrats, imperial remnants, and Germanic groups. In Spain, Vandals, Sueves, and others established themselves amid the wreckage of Roman administration. In North Africa, the Vandals seized one of the Western Empire's richest regions, cutting deeply into the tax base and grain supply. Africa mattered terribly. Without African revenue, the Western government struggled to pay armies. Without armies, it struggled to recover revenue. The circle of weakness tightened. The loss was not merely territorial. It was fiscal, strategic, and psychological. Rome's Western machinery had depended on the resources of provinces that were now slipping into hands of rulers who might use Roman administrative habits, but no longer obeyed the Western emperor. The figure of Attila the Hun then entered Roman fear like a storm on horseback. Attila's power was not mindless destruction. It was diplomatic, military, and political. He extracted tribute, manipulated Roman weakness, commanded a confederation of peoples, and understood the value of terror. The Hunnic Empire was brief compared with Rome, but for a time it shook the world from the Danube to Gaul and Italy. Roman generals had to negotiate, pay, fight, and endure. Even when Attila died and Hunnic power fragmented, the shock remained. In this age, generals often mattered more than emperors. Men such as Stilicho, Aetius, Radzimer, and others stood behind or above weak imperial figures, commanding armies, bargaining with federate groups, arranging politics, and surviving court intrigue. Some were of mixed or non-Roman ancestry, yet operated within Roman systems. They revealed the late Western Empire's deepest ambiguity. It was still Roman, but its power depended on men whom earlier Roman ideology might have treated as outsiders. It needed them. It feared them. It used them. They used it. The emperors of the West became increasingly fragile. Some were children. Some were puppets. Some ruled little beyond Italy. Some were raised by military strongmen and removed when no longer useful. The imperial office retained symbolic power, but symbolism could not collect taxes by itself. It could not force loyalty from armies that expected payment. It could not rebuild a fleet lost to Vandals. It could not restore abandoned administrative habits in provinces now ruled by kings. In 455, Rome was sacked again, this time by the Vandals. The event reinforced the sense of a world unmoored. Yet even here, the language of total destruction can mislead. The city suffered, treasures were taken, people were carried away, but Rome continued to exist. The empire's end was not the end of urban life. Christianity, Latin culture, law, or aristocratic identity. Much endured by changing masters. Then came 476. The Western Emperor Romulus Augustulus, a boy with a name heavy, almost to the point of cruelty, was deposed by Odoacer, a military leader who sent the imperial insignia to the Eastern Emperor. The symbolism was immense, but the practical reality was more subtle. Odoacer did not declare the Roman world abolished. He ruled Italy as king while acknowledging, in form, the authority of the emperor in the East. The Western imperial office disappeared, but Roman administration, senatorial families, taxes, landholding, church structures, and law did not vanish overnight. The date matters because historians need markers, but lived history is rarely obedient to dates. For a landowner in Gaul, a bishop in Spain, a merchant in Italy, a farmer in North Africa, or a soldier seeking pay. The transformation had been unfolding for decades. The Western Empire was not murdered by one hand. It was weakened by civil war, fiscal loss, military dependency, political instability, elite self-interest, frontier migration, external pressure, disease, and the inability of central government to command enough loyalty and resources at the same time. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. We do not know how many people noticed the end when it came. We do not know whether a peasant in a cold village cared whose face had once been stamped on the coins he no longer saw. We do not know how many Roman aristocrats mourned the empire publicly while privately making terms with new kings. We do not know how many soldiers felt betrayal or relief or nothing at all. The Western Empire came apart because its parts learned to live without the whole. That is one of the most frightening forms of collapse. Not sudden annihilation, but replacement. Not silence, but a change in who gives orders. Not the end of life, but the end of a structure that once seemed necessary, then slowly became optional. Rome had taken over everything it could reach. Then, in the West, it lost the power to hold everything together. What remains of Rome is not only ruin, it is a road under a modern road, a word inside another word, a law behind a law, a city plan beneath a city plan, a border remembered long after the soldiers left, a dream of order that refuses to die, a warning carved into stone, then buried, then found again by hands that were never meant to touch it. Rome did not disappear when the Western imperial office faded. No civilization of such scale vanishes like breath on glass. It became inheritance. It became memory. It became argument. It became a name claimed by kings, bishops, emperors, lawyers, rebels, scholars, architects, dictators, republics, and nations who wanted some fragment of its authority. The empire as a political machine fractured, but Rome as an idea entered the deep bloodstream of history. That is why its ruins feel strangely alive. Stand in an abandoned amphitheater at dusk, when the seats are empty and the grass rises through cracks in the stone, and one can almost hear the lost crowd. Not clearly, not as sound, more like pressure in the air, the murmur of thousands waiting for spectacle, vendors calling, children shifting beside parents, the elite seated in their proper places, the poor looking down from higher rows, sand below, gates closed, sunlight striking helmets, animal cages, painted shields, and faces trained to hide fear. The arena is silent now, but silence is not absence. It is evidence of time. Walk along a Roman road where the stones still hold their line across the countryside, and the mind begins to understand something of Roman will. These were not merely paths of movement, they were declarations against confusion. They said that the state could impose direction upon distance. They carried armies, officials, merchants, tax collectors, prisoners, letters, rumors, faiths, diseases, and dreams. Roads made conquest durable, but they also made connection possible. Long after imperial command weakened, the roots remained, guiding feet that no longer marched for Rome. The aqueducts remain among the most haunting monuments of practical imagination. They cross valleys like skeletons of intention. Their arches seem too calm for what they represent. Water captured far away, measured, carried, filtered, distributed, and displayed. Such structures remind us that empire was never only battle, it was maintenance, it was mathematics, it was repair crews, surveyors, masons, quarry workers, engineers, administrators, slaves, and taxpayers. The grandeur of Rome rested not only upon victory, but upon repeated acts of organization, This is what makes its collapse so instructive. A civilization can possess brilliance and brutality at the same time. It can build roads and slave markets, libraries and execution grounds, legal systems and conquest states, baths and battlefields. It can bring peace to some while crushing others. It can preserve knowledge while destroying cities. It can offer citizenship and demand obedience. Rome was never simply noble and never simply monstrous. It was human power magnified to a terrifying scale. The law endured. Roman legal thinking shaped later worlds in ways more durable than many monuments. Ideas of contracts, property, citizenship, procedure, inheritance, public authority, and legal classification survived, adapted, and reappeared across centuries. Law was one of Rome's most profound technologies. It transformed power into language. It made relationships recordable, punishable, transferable, and debatable. It did not make society equal, but it made authority intelligible. That alone gave it astonishing longevity. Language endured too. Latin changed as all living speech changes. In the streets, barracks, farms, ports, and kitchens of the western provinces, spoken Latin evolved into new tongues. The empire's voice did not die. It became many voices, words once spoken by soldiers, traders, mothers, clerks, priests, and laborers moved through time, altered by region and memory. Even where Latin ceased to be common speech, it survived in church, scholarship, law, medicine, and ritual. A dead language, people say, but dead things do not usually argue so loudly in the present. Christian Rome became another inheritance. The faith once persecuted within the empire outlived the Western imperial state and carried Roman habits into new ages. Bishops governed communities, preserved texts, negotiated with kings, organized charity, defended cities, and inherited some of the moral authority once attached to civic office. The Church did not simply replace the empire, but in many places it preserved fragments of Roman administration, literacy, hierarchy, and universal imagination. The city of Rome changed from imperial capital to sacred center. Its authority transformed but not extinguished. In the East, Roman power continued for centuries. The empire ruled from Constantinople remained Roman in law, court ceremony, military tradition, and self-understanding, even as language, religion, and political conditions evolved. To speak of Rome falling entirely in 476 is to mistake the end of one imperial office for the death of an entire civilization. The Eastern Empire carried the Roman name through new struggles, new enemies, new triumphs, and new disasters. Rome had changed capitals, changed forms, changed languages of power, yet continued to call itself Roman. Still, the Western collapse became a mirror for later ages. Every civilization that studies Rome sees itself. Republics see warnings about corruption, inequality, militarized politics, and the death of civic trust. Empires see lessons about frontiers, taxation, assimilation, military overreach, and administrative burden. Cities see the fragility of infrastructure. Nations see the danger of confusing expansion with health. Citizens see how liberty can be surrendered in exchange for order when fear becomes unbearable. Rome asks uncomfortable questions. How much inequality can a society survive before loyalty thins? How long can military power serve the state before it begins to choose the state? How many peoples can be ruled by one center before the center no longer understands the edges. How much violence can be hidden behind the language of peace? How often does collapse arrive not as destruction, but as the quiet discovery that old institutions no longer matter? Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. Beneath European streets, beneath North African fields, beneath the stones of Middle Eastern towns, beneath churches, vineyards, apartment blocks, and silent hills, the Roman world remains unfinished as a question. Stratigraphic excavation continues to reveal lost rooms, drains, graves, workshops, coins, cooking pots, inscriptions, sandals, bones, and seeds. Genomic data traces mobility across imperial lands. Isotopic analysis follows childhood diets and distant origins. Radiocarbon dating anchors lives once dissolved into legend. Every discovery adds detail, yet the whole remains too vast to hold. Perhaps that is why Rome still haunts us. It was immense, but mortal. It was disciplined, but unstable. It was civilized, but cruel. It was confident, but afraid. It claimed eternity, but time answered, and so we stand among its remains, answerless, adrift to ponder. We look at broken columns and see not failure alone, but endurance through transformation. We look at collapsed walls and remember that all walls are temporary. We look at inscriptions naming the powerful and wonder about the unnamed hands that lifted the stones. Rome took over everything it could reach. Then it became everything that remembered it. Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made, what buried archives may emerge, what forgotten cemetery may speak, what drowned harbor may yield its cargo, what ordinary life may rise again from mud and ash. But the lesson already waits in the ruins. No empire is eternal, no collapse is simple, and no road through history runs only one way.